We've come now to our Friday feature Movie Spotlight, where we review the latest cinematic releases and more. Joining us in the studio today are two esteemed film critics. First, we have Jason Bechervaise. Jason, hello. It's good to see you.
Hello, Jeong. It's always great to be here.
And today we have Marc Raymond here with us as well. Marc, hello. It's great to see you too.
Yes, nice to be here.
So again, for this segment today, since it's Chuseok, we're changing things up. Instead of our usual reviews of new films, today we asked our critics to pick a couple of films that they wanted to highlight for our listeners and viewers to watch at home during this Chuseok. And we've got an interesting couple of choices. One is a modern classic, which I think we'll all agree it is, and one more recent. The first is one I think many will have heard and seen. It is JSA, or Joint Security Area, directed by Park Chan-wook. In Korean it's called 공동경비구역 JSA. Jason, I believe you chose this one. One reason you chose it is because it was released in time for Chuseok back in the year 2000, right?
Yeah, that's right. 22 years ago, it was released on September the 9th, 2000, which actually was a Saturday. Korean films used to be released on Saturdays in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then it was Fridays and Thursdays, and now films are often released on Wednesdays. Mm. And the reason they release these tentpoles ahead of the big holidays is because the studios want to attract as many people as possible. And during Chuseok especially, there are lots of families that used to go. We're seeing a somewhat different trend now, but traditionally that's what happens. Families go to the cinema. And this film came around a year or 18 months after Shiri that would ultimately transform the industry. The timing of release is also interesting because it was released 3 months after the summit between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il, in what was seen as an improvement, a milestone in the relations between the two countries, North and South Korea. The reason I mention that is because the film, I think many people will be aware, it's set in the demilitarized zone. The border between North and South Korea. The film itself is split into 3 parts. It's not a linear narrative. It's somewhat confusing, I would say, but I think that adds to the complexity of the film. So in terms of the plot, there's been a shooting in the demilitarized zone in JSA at the South and North Korean border, involving North and South Korean soldiers played by Shin Ha-kyun, Song Kang-ho, Byung-hun, and Kim Dae-jung. And both sides agreed that there should be an investigation headed by the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, and conducting this investigation is a character played by Lee Young-ae, a Swiss Army Major Jean. And so the first film focuses on the procedure, and actually Jean's superior stresses the procedure is more important than the outcome. And then the film kind of flashes back in the second part to the actual events, and then the final part is kind of a mixture between the past and the present, and we find out what really happened. It's Park Chan-wook's third film, his first kind of commercial film, and this is the film that really kind of where he made a name for himself. It's also produced by Kim Dae-jung of Myung Films. She was one of the most famous and renowned film producers in Korea. It screened at the Berlin Film Festival. It's also based on a book called DMZ by Park Sang-hyun.
Marc, as Jason said, this was Park's third film, and one that really kickstarted his career. How would you compare it to his other features?
Yeah, it's interesting. I rewatched this film actually just yesterday, and it had been many years since I watched the film. And yeah, it's very different, I think, from his typical films and what he became known as. This really was the film that allowed him to then get the power to make movies that are closer to his own sensibility, I think.
Right, so this was more conventional, you're saying?
It's a more conventional film. Like Jason mentioned, it has some interesting elements. Some of the storytelling flourishes in terms of, the non-linear structure and things like that. But I don't think if you watch this film I mean, it's very stylishly directed like all of his movies are, but it doesn't have a lot of the same thematic elements that he would become known for, especially with the Vengeance trilogy, but even the his more recent films like The Handmaiden or this year's Reason to Leave, or Decision to Leave, I should say. And those two films, I think, link more with what we think of as a Park Chan-wook film now than this film. And I think part of it is that it is a movie that's dealing with these big national kind of themes, right? And I think, I don't think that's really a big concern of his other films in the same way. But you can kind of, when you sort of rewatch the film, you can really see sort of why this film was successful, because it is very well made. The two lead performances in particular are very really stand out and really went a long ways to, I think, creating the star images of both Song Kang-ho and Byung-hun. But as a Park Chan-wook film, I think it is, it's probably, if somebody had not seen this film and was a big Park Chan-wook fan, they probably would be like, oh, that's very different from his other kind of work, I think.
Interesting. So, Jason, if it doesn't have Park Chan-wook's signature stylistic flourishes, then why do you think this film still proved so successful and popular? Why did you pick it out today?
Well, I think if you go back and you look at the film industry in the 1990s and early 2000s, all the big auteurs made their debuts between 96 and 2000. And Park Chan-wook was the only exception to that. But he was able to make this film. And I've been watching Korean films for many, many years, 20 years, and how they capture North and South Korean interrelations is something that I find particularly fascinating. And this film just really is a really compelling film in that regard. I mean, I love the use of space and symmetry in the film. This idea of, on the one hand, you want reconciliation, but on the other hand, is it a realistic prospect? Now, if you look at what's happened over the last 20 years in terms of inter-Korean relations, has much changed? I mean, this is a question I ask my students. And you could argue, well, actually, not all that much has changed, except that perhaps North Korea has developed more, dangerous weapons. But the industry, though, has changed significantly since then. And it's very difficult, I think, for new filmmakers to get the opportunities that Park Chan-wook had to make this incredibly engrossing film. It has a bit of melodrama in there as well. It has all the elements you associate with local blockbusters, these templates that proved so successful over the years. But at the same time, it's incredibly intelligent. As Marc mentioned, the performances are absolutely fantastic. It's got moments of humor. It's got moments of tragedy. And it's just really well told. The narrative structure is really, really interesting. I miss these films. I wish we could see more of them.
Right. So even though, Marc, you've said perhaps it's more conventional than what we might think of Park Chan-wook, it still is a significant film. It's still, as I said earlier, considered a modern classic, right?
Yeah, it's still a very good film, and it's and I don't think it's necessarily a negative of the film that it isn't, as it's a bit of an outlier in terms of maybe not linking him up thematically with his other films. It kind of showed that Park Chan-wook can make a film that's clearly meant to be a huge release, that's going to be hopefully appeal to this very mass audience, and still make something that is very, sophisticated, very intelligent. And the way the movie handles North-South relations in particular is just very complex, and I think way more complex than one had seen maybe in a lot of the films of the past, and one that I think still holds up sort of quite well today when you look at it.
Sure.
In terms of how it kind of looks at the North-South situation, and as Jason was mentioning, maybe that's partly because things haven't changed very much since the film was released.
And it doesn't romanticize North Korea. It humanizes the characters.
Right.
The North Koreans are not villains, and in that sense, it's very significant because the films in the 60s, 70s, the films that dealt with North Korea, by and large, they were anti-communist films.
So JSA, 22 years later, still important and influential and timely as well. Let's move on to our second film that we're discussing today. It's a much lesser known film than JSA. It was released in 2019, and it's a Korean indie family drama / comedy called Move the Grave, or Ijang in Korean. Mark, I believe you picked this one out. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, this is the first film from director Jeong Seung-o. And he had made many kind of acclaimed short films before then, but this is his first kind of feature. And the plot involves a familiar task in contemporary Korea, which is having to move the grave of a buried relative due to land development. And in this case, it is the remains of the father of a family of 5 children. Okay, so
it's a big family.
So there's a lot of characters, there's a lot of plot. You have the oldest, Hae-young, who is divorced, and she has this troublesome young son who is around. There's Gum-ok, who is the next sister, whose husband is having an affair. We have Gum-hee, who has just become engaged to be married. And then we have Hae-yan, who is the youngest daughter. She's still in university, is an active feminist, and really represents kind of modernity, the more modern kind of values as opposed to the traditional. And then you have the only son, Sung-rak, and the others have very little contact with him. But because of the patriarchal views of the father's brother, they cannot move the grave without the son. So the plot of the movie is basically they got to track him down. Right? They have to find him in order for them to then use to, in order for them to get on with this ritual. Many of which of the family kind of don't even really want to do, but are kind of obligated to do. So it is very much about a dysfunctional kind of family unit, and is very, I think, specific to the Korean context at the same time. And yeah, I think this kind of family dynamic, a lot of the humor comes from these kind of clashes, but also a lot of the sociological kind of insight as well. So I think the film does a really good job of mixing this kind of the comedy. It's a very entertaining film, very fun to watch, but it also manages to say quite a bit about Korea and how Korea is kind of changing, and these different values, and how do you deal with these kind of clashes, which of course is universal beyond Korean families, but also gets at some specific details here.
Right, we talked earlier on the show actually how important it is during this holiday to tend to your family's graves and honor your ancestors. So this is a very timely film for this holiday, it seems. Jason, it was, as we said, not very well known to audiences at the time, though.
Yeah.
It is available on Netflix now, though. How did it slip through the cracks originally?
Well, it debuted in Jeonju in 2019. It actually won a CGV Arthouse Award, which is one of the best awards to get because it basically guarantees distribution. But the timing wasn't fortuitous because the film was really well received by those in the industry, and clearly CGV Arthouse had high hopes for it. But it basically was released in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and it just wasn't able to kind of generate the strong word of mouth that I think would have happened had it been released in so-called normal times, which is a real shame because the film is terrific. As Marc mentions, it deals with a lot of different things. You've got these very colourful, interesting characters, all dealing with their own issues, and they're all kind of fighting amongst each other. And it's also culturally really interesting, and I think a lot of people will learn a lot through this film. But at the same time, it's not a movie that yes, it is culturally specific, but at the same time, we all deal with grief in one way or another at some point in our lives, and we're all part of families, and not all families function properly. And I think a lot of people will identify with that, and it finds moments of humor. These characters are really well scripted, really well acted. It's kind of a part road movie as well, a bit of Miss Sunshine, and I loved it. It's a really enchanting, comical film that tonally just hits all the right notes.
Right, I think that last point about tonally hitting the right notes, it is really hard for dramedies, as they call it, comedies, to find that right balance, right?
Yeah, it's it can really go off track very easily, right? We all know these kind of films that try to get ambitious with their tone and kind of shift tones, and it just doesn't work at all, and you're just and the film can really go off and you can really lose interest. And this film, I think, grounds itself. I think part of it is just it grounds the comedy, even though, as Jason said, the characters are colorful. They're kind of but they're not like caricatures or anything like that. They're relatable. You seem like, oh yeah, I've seen people like this, right? There is a sort of ground, even though it's slightly heightened, there is a kind of grounding of the characters and in types that we've seen, right? And especially how those types then interact within the family dynamic is very familiar, right? Because that makes for a lot of the entertainment and a lot of the comedy is through this. And at the same time, because it's about these family dynamics, it's very easy to also allow for a certain emotional connection at the same time. Yeah.
I must admit, I hadn't heard of this film until
You're intrigued,
today.
Jeong, aren't you?
Well, I'm definitely intrigued. I'm certainly convinced, and I think I might check it out this weekend. It's called
Please
Move
do.
the Grave, or Ijang in Korean. That's where we'll wrap it up for our Chuseok edition of a Movie Spotlight. Mark, Jason, it's been a pleasure as always. Have a great Chuseok, and we'll see you next time.
You too.
Yeah. Thank you.